Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be introducing this session while the technology sorts itself out. My name's Stephen Dorrell. I chair Public Policy Projects, which is a London-based policy institute which has been operating for over 20 years, but hitherto has always been very much UK focused. And we welcome all the participants in this call, which is a new series for us of policy-based webinars. I'm conscious that a new webinar might be thought to be the last thing people want at this moment, but I hope you will feel that this is an important initiative. We're doing it, Public Policy Projects, in partnership with the Diplomat magazine, which is a magazine founded in 1947, circulates round the London diplomatic community. And the purpose of this series of webinars is to create a more international context for public policy discussion. One of the key developments of recent years has been a tendency for some countries, possibly including our own, in order to retreat into a national viewpoint. And what the purpose of these seminars, webinars, will be to bring into the discussion points of view from a wide range of different countries, facilitated by the diplomatic community. And I'm delighted that we're joined by representatives of almost 100 diplomatic missions on this call this morning, diplomatic missions in London, to focus on what is the key issue, not just in Britain, but all around the world, which is how to get the world economy moving again in a world where COVID is something that we're all going to have to live with. We should be looking both at the different ways different countries are getting their domestic economies moving, but also, and critically, how we get world trade, world investment moving. And in later sessions, we should be inviting ambassadors from individual countries to bring their experts into this discussion to provide that kind of international exchange around public policy. So that's the purpose of the World Economic Series. And we're delighted that in this session, we're able to launch that discussion with two very distinguished guests, Her Majesty's Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps and the Lord Mayor of London. I'll do a couple of housekeeping points first, and then, if I may, I will introduce our two guests. First of all, on housekeeping, I do ask participants in the call to observe the Chatham House rule. I don't need to tell the diplomatic community what the Chatham House rule says. I do ask, please, people to stay on mute unless they're brought into the discussion. And if you wish to participate in the discussion after the initial presentations, please indicate that you wish to do so through the chat function. So to launch the session, I'm delighted to welcome, as I said, Her Majesty's Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps, Alistair Harrison, who served as a distinguished diplomat in Warsaw, at the United Nations, and at the European Commission before he became Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps in 2014. Alistair, you're extremely welcome, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And can I begin by thanking Public Policy Projects, in particular Max Austin, and Diplomat magazine and its editor, Benicio Van Kuffelen, for organising this webinar, the first in what I think promises to be a very interesting and useful series on the theme of rebooting the world economy. Now, I know you're all very anxious to hear the Lord Mayor, so I thought I'd just begin by briefly throwing out a few ideas and questions which might stimulate our discussions today. It's clear that we're all facing what is almost certainly the most challenging world crisis of our lifetimes. And as the chairman said in his introduction, all countries are going to have to cooperate with each other, learn from each other. And as we face the economic consequences of COVID-19, economic diplomacy is going to be more important than ever. Now, of course, economic diplomacy is not new. Mr. Chairman, you referred to my service in Warsaw, and It was when I was there 25 years ago that on a visit to Gdańsk, I saw one of the most interesting documents of my diplomatic career, a letter from Queen Elizabeth to the City Council of Gdańsk in Poland. And that letter called for closer political relations between London and Gdańsk, but also for the development of trade to the mutual benefit of both countries. And that letter wasn't written by our present Queen, but by Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century. So economic diplomacy.
Yes, could we stay on mute? But please, Alistair, carry on. Daniel, I think, Daniel Lynch, I'm afraid, sorry to call you out, but I think it's your, Alistair, carry on.
I'll unmute. There we are. Can you hear me again?
I can.
Good. So economic diplomacy is a well-established part of the diplomatic profession, and it's going to acquire increasing significance as we work together to reboot the world economy. But I think we should also remember something else. There is no world crisis so bad that with a little effort, diplomats, possibly helped by politicians, economists, and the like, can't make it much worse. I'm thinking of the Wall Street crash of 1929, which was effortlessly turned into the Great Depression of the 30s, as governments turned to raising interest rates and to introducing protectionist measures, when what they should have been doing was the exact reverse. So let's not repeat those mistakes this time round. The economic fundamentals haven't changed, and protectionism will always be a self-defeating and self-harming policy. But if the fundamentals haven't changed, the detailed challenges that await us as we work to reboot the world economy are certainly different. A completely external shock to the world economy, a medical rather than a political or economic one, is something that humanity hasn't faced on this scale for over a century, with the Spanish flu just after the First World War. So diplomats and other economic actors are going to have to be more nimble than ever before in pushing for the fastest economic recovery possible. Trade deals and business deals will have to be pursued at a speed never before seen. The swift cannot wait for the slow. And so the diplomatic virtues of patience and persistence may have to be somewhat refined. But equally, even a crisis as horrible as the pandemic may eventually throw up opportunities. I have seen encouraging quotes from businesses to the effect that COVID-19 has already accelerated change, and that the disruption it causes has also presented opportunities as well as challenges. The rethinking of supply chains, adaptation to new markets, and understanding new economic models will all present challenges. We may find that modern monetary theory may become as much part of our economic toolkit as Keynes or the neoclassical school. And such challenges to our economic thinking come, let's remember, not much more than a decade after the great financial crisis of 2008-2009, which itself also caused us all to rethink what seemed to be established certainties. If one thinks back just 3 decades ago, say, business and individuals had to cope with interest rates which were in the high teens pretty much as standard. The events of 2008 brought them down to what seemed like a new normal in low single figures. But now interest rates are ranged from what one might call negligible to negative, and finance is in danger of being turned on its head. So we're all going to have to learn to think quite differently. And the COVID crisis gives a new urgency both to our thoughts and to our actions. Countries are going to have to work together, both bilaterally and in the multilateral networks of which we're all part. The United Nations and its specialized agencies will have much to do, and the World Health Organization and the humanitarian organizations have a particular role to play at the moment. As a diplomat who spent much of my career working with the UN, I know that that organization is actually much more adaptable than is sometimes supposed. But similarly, organizations such as the G7 and the G20 and the regional organizations, they're all going to have to rethink their agendas. But a quick recovery is going to benefit all nations. So I think that the agenda for diplomats, as for everybody else, is going to be a demanding one for the next months and the next years. And the series of webinars that's being launched today is going to make a huge contribution to our thinking. Thank you very much.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed for your generous words. And the dangers that you quote of politicians and diplomats resorting to measures that make the position worse is precisely, of course, the danger that hopefully we're not simply recognizing, but organizing to try to resist. So thank you indeed for that introduction. I turn now to Alderman William Russell, who's, as everyone knows, Lord Mayor of the City of London. And the reason that I asked William to join us this morning is that I've always thought the City of London had a global internationalist instinct long before either of those words were in regular use. And so to invite the Lord Mayor of the City of London to be present at the launch of this series is to mark the role of London as an international financial centre, but also as an advocate of the kind of values that Alistair was saying are important. So, William, you're extremely welcome, and we look forward to what you have to say to us.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. It's a joy to be here with you all today. And I know that today we have a wide and diverse audience, including many ambassadors and the diplomatic community. So before I continue, I want to offer you my thanks. I cannot imagine how difficult your job has been over the last 3 months, often away from your families, your offices, your countries, your colleagues, at a time when international relations and how they are maintained have been more important than ever. I hope with the UK economy starting to open that this will start to make your jobs a little more manageable. In a way, the crisis has reflected the necessity of our international relations. How often is it that we experience a true global event, perhaps a couple of times a generation? COVID-19 has affected almost every part of the world, and the world responded by working closer from further away. Whether that's international scientists dropping their research to find a cure for COVID-19, armed forces shipping protective equipment to foreign lands which needed them most, or indeed the global business community coming together to find a way to manage our respective economies through the crisis. And our ambassadors and diplomats have always been an important part of that story. Usually during a Lord Mayor's year, it is a custom to host an event called the Easter Banquet, and is an opportunity for all the diplomats to the UK to meet each other and form new partnerships, as well as an opportunity to hear from the Foreign Secretary about the priorities of the UK government and international policy. Sadly, we didn't have a banquet this year, but thankfully, as I'm serving a second term as Lord Mayor, the first time this has happened since 1861 with Sir William Cubitt, I will hopefully be able to host many of you next Easter. The Easter Banquet is one of the most important events for a Lord Mayor, because it is a crucial opportunity to express their gratitude to the ambassadors and diplomats. All of you are a vital part of any Lord Mayor's year. We work closely with you, your offices, and the British ambassadors in your countries to build on our historic relationship, fortifying new business deals and supporting the growth of each other's economies. Your knowledge and expertise are indispensable. Without it, it would be impossible to do my job of being an international spokesperson for the UK's financial and professional services. And as the UK starts to slowly but carefully reopen its economy, it is vital that we ask ourselves this question. How can we take what we have learned throughout this pandemic and use it to build better international relations? Perhaps this is something for the discussion in a moment, but one thing which has become indispensable is technology. In one very literal way, I have not been able to travel to international economies like a Lord Mayor normally would, visiting some 30 countries over a year. But in another way, I've been going all over the world. Through technology, like what we're using now, I've had conferences in Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Australia, the United States. In fact, one day last week, I started off in the morning in Mumbai, went to Beijing, then on to Melbourne and came back to the UK for lunch, and all without jet lag. This has been a part of my virtual engagement program. Through it, I've been working alongside our long-established business partners to ensure that we in the City of London understand their concerns during COVID-19. Specifically, if they think the pandemic will affect the way they work with London and the UK, and what we in the City of London Corporation can do to support them during this time. I've been in listening mode throughout this program, and it has been really a fascinating experience. It makes me incredibly keen to continue supporting the UK financial professional services, especially at this important shift in our recovery. And that staged approach has been a crucial part of the city's response to the pandemic. During the lockdown, the City of London Corporation has had 3 COVID-19 response priorities: supporting the city to help employees, businesses, and the financial system; sustaining our work on the UK's long-term competitiveness, for example, by continuing our climate action work; and speeding the recovery and help relaunch a full and strong economy. Of course, the industries for which I am spokesperson are going to help shape what the recovery looks like, and they in turn have been affected themselves. But there has been no systematic breakdown of the markets, and we see signs of them stabilizing now as we emerge from this phase of the pandemic. There is also some great work being done by the City UK on their recapitalisation project, which collects thinking on a number of issues, for example, how the private sector can support UK SMEs to manage unsustainable debt built up during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the financial firms I've spoken to have adjusted well to life in lockdown. And although many are working from home, there's been remarkable consistency in productivity levels. We are beginning to look at options for getting people back into the office. However, one of the city's biggest concerns is transport, which is why we are continuing to have daily conversations with Transport for London to ensure industry concerns are being communicated on this. And as we begin planning for a life after COVID, we must think not only how we can recover, but how we can build back better. Many firms I have spoken to have emphasized the importance that the recovery must be green. The UK is the leader of green finance, the financial sector's efforts to reaching net zero carbon emissions, but by not only investing in sustainable infrastructure and modeling how climate change will affect global markets. And the City of London is a centre for green finance, with over 130 green bonds on the London Stock Exchange. And I'm proud that the City of London Corporation and the UK government co-launched the Green Finance Institute, the Centre for Financial Solutions for transitioning to a low carbon economy. All this expertise provides us with a great opportunity to improve our infrastructure as we emerge back onto the global stage. So in closing, the pandemic has been a time of great difficulty. However, I believe ahead of us, we have a real opportunity to come back from this pandemic stronger than ever before. I remain confident about the United Kingdom's place as a world leader, and we remain a great friend to all our international partners as we all vow to build back better. Thank you very much.
Lord Mayor, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And you used the phrase a true global event. You said that COVID was a true global event and in that respect unusual. And then you referred in your closing remarks to green finance and that's relevant, I think, because before the COVID crisis hit us, there was an increasing recognition that the risk of a true global challenge, if not a true global event, the biggest risk potentially lay in the climate crisis and climate change. And we're delighted this morning that on this call is Inga Anderson, the Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. And I think Inga may wish to respond to the point that you just made about the potential true global challenge, which will of course persist when the immediate storm clouds associated with COVID start to clear. Is Inga on the call? Yes, I can see you.
Very much, and certainly congratulations to you, Stephen, if I may, as well as to the Diplomat Magazine and Public Policy Project for pulling together this series. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and obviously a great honor to be speaking right after Her Majesty's Marshal of the Diplomatic Corps and the Lord Mayor of the City of London. So thank you. I mean, what we are seeing on the economy is obviously very serious, and I think we all know that. It's much deeper than the Great Depression, and we are just yesterday, we saw the new IMF numbers, which project worse than what we thought in April at 4.9% contraction for 2020. So that reality is not without severe significance. The Eurozone is looking at a 10.2% contraction 2020, according to projections, and then a 5% expansion in 2021. And what we thought was a great equalizer in terms of everyone being equally impacted by the COVID, everyone, irrespective of class and race, etc., irrespective of country, we are now seeing that those that have the ability, countries as well as individuals, are less infected. Stimulus packages can be afforded in some countries and not in others. And meanwhile, 1.6 billion people are still impacted one way or the other in terms of jobs and lockdowns and not being able to go to the office. So the economy is in a vulnerable state, which is of course what we in the United Nations deal with, are those that are particularly impacted, and they are already going through a fairly sluggish growth and have relatively limited fiscal space to support the health sector, let alone to support and stimulate a flagging economy. And that should be everyone's concern, because a wealthy, growing world is a more stable world, and a world that has deep crisis is clearly not so. And that links to these three planetary crises, and the Lord Mayor reflected on these: the climate crisis, I'd like to add the nature crisis, and the pollution crisis. And we in the world, in the United Nations Environment Programme, often work on these. And here, let me bring me to my second point, which deal with the stimulus. Because governments have reacted very decisively on these stimulus packages, but in a number of countries, without the sufficient greenness. And here we need examples. We need examples where actually cities and countries have acted with a green sheen on these stimulus packages. Recent research looked at 17 countries that have made these stimulus packages and found that 13 actually had made it with fairly detrimental impacts to the environmental direction that they had set for themselves, be it on either of the three crises: the climate, the nature, or the pollution crisis. And so, and if we take on top of that the fact that nature has in a sense been suffering its own pandemic right under our noses for the last many decades, with species loss, with nature loss, with fragmentation, with biodiversity loss, with ecosystem loss, etc., which obviously is a factor in the increasing number of zoonoses that we are seeing, we need to take account of that, as well as obviously on climate. And that leads me to my third point. Exactly as the Lord Mayor said, building back better. That needs to be building back better, meaning building forward for resilience in the future. Economic resilience, financial resilience, but most certainly also environmental resilience. And here we can say for sure that what we need is obviously to spur the economy and spur growth and spur jobs. But we see also that green investments often has a greater job outcome. Certainly green energy investments have a much higher job content. The World Bank's recent numbers shows us that in the US, for example, you could create a larger number of jobs in energy saving, retrofitting buildings, for example. You create 17 jobs per 1 million, 22 jobs for mass transit, 13 for wind, 14 for solar, but just 5 jobs in the oil and gas sector. So per million. So the story here is that we can actually drive jobs and drive green growth and drive green stimulus. And in so doing, if we at the same time invest in nature, in nature stability, we are and we enforce rules on illegal wildlife trade, then we have a greater chance of ensuring that we will not see a COVID-19-like situation in the future. So if I could conclude, thinking about in this forum what kind of green packages and what kind of green solidarity can be set into place. The Secretary General of the United Nations has made it very clear in his call that COVID does not know boundaries or borders, and it is only by ensuring inclusion and reaching the very poorest and those most vulnerable that we can address this. If one country has COVID, we all have COVID. It is in fact the same as we have been saying about the 3 crises. Nature and climate knows no boundaries, and climate change is a thing that impacts us all. And we have an opportunity here to make some significant shifts in our economies at the time when governments are in the business right now of putting the hand of government into finance and economy. So let's do it with a mind to the future. Let's do it with a mind to sustainability and resilience, such that this crisis can be inverted, but also such that we flick that green switch, exactly as the Lord Mayor has said. So with that, let me stop and congratulate once more yourselves for organizing this conference. Thank you.
Inga, thank you very much for that contribution.